So, Ms.
Okay.
Gioia Scappucci, yes, hello. Thank you for being here with us today. You escaped our COVID case today because you are connecting from Zoom, and Gioia Scappucci couldn't join us in person, but we are very happy to have her here as Executive Secretary of the Lanzarote Committee. She is an administrator at the Council of Europe since July 2001, and since 2012 she works within the Children's Rights Division as the Executive Secretary to the Lanzarote Committee. And we will know more about this committee and the convention, which probably you already know. Listen to her. Previously, she worked for the Secretariats of the European Committee of Social Rights, the Steering Committee for Human Rights, and the Advisory Committee of the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities. So we have an expert here for what concerns civil institutional management of reporting and abuse in a Western, I would say, European, mainly European context. Before passing over to Ms. Scappucci, let me also introduce the discussant, because I think it's very interesting that after the contribution of Ms. Scappucci, we will also listen to the contribution of Ms. Lisa Horda from the Philippines, so another word. Ms. Horda is the Chief Prosecutor of the Department of Justice based in Tacloban City in the Philippines. And since 2005, she has focused on cases involving violations of the Anti-Violence Against Women Act, Child Abuse Law, and the Anti-Trafficking Person Act. She has a very long CV. She was also part of the Task Force Against Human Trafficking in Region 7. And she also handled case of online sexual exploitation of children. So we will also have the opportunity to listen to the expertise and experience of someone working in the field in a completely different environment and context. So now I pass over to Ms. Scappucci. I will be managing your presentation that we will share with the audience. So over to you, Ms. Scappucci, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much to you for having invited me, and it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be with you this afternoon. I'm really sorry I cannot be in Rome, notwithstanding COVID cases or whatever. I would have loved to be there with you, but it's really good that thanks to Zoom I can be connected with you and anyhow take part in this important exchange that is happening this afternoon, and a contribution to the overall event, which is taking place over the next days. So as has been said, I work at the Council of Europe, which is a regional organization which groups 46 countries and which has amongst its main tasks that of setting standards in the field of human rights. And one of the important conventions in this area is the Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse. And this is the convention which is also known as Lanzarote Convention. So my presentation today is meant to inform you about the relevant provisions in this convention which concern reporting and assistance to victims also in part, and the situation that the monitoring body of this convention has assessed so far with respect to these provisions, so that I can give you a few ideas of the promising practices, but also of the gaps identified and the recommendations made by the committee to parties, hoping that this can be of inspiration for other countries as well, and looking forward to hearing the more practitioners' experience coming from Lisa just after me this afternoon. So you can move on to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, this convention is a Council of Europe convention, which, however, is not limited only to European states. I think this is very important to say today, because of the public of this event, which covers all the different areas of the world. And therefore, it should be underlined that this convention is an open convention. Currently, it has 48 parties to it, all of the Council of Europe member states, plus two others, the Russian Federation and Tunisia. But any other country across the globe which wishes to be bound by common benchmarks in the area of preventing sexual violence against children, protecting the children against these any kind of sexual offense in their respect, be it online or offline, as well as prosecuting these offenses, is welcome to approach the Secretariat of the committee, so myself, I will give you my contact details at the end, or the Council of Europe in general, to have information on, as to how to become a party to this convention. The convention has the specificity of wanting to ensure that these benchmarks are actually put in place effectively. And therefore, it has set up also a mechanism which is composed of representatives of all of the parties to the convention, but also representatives of NGOs and other relevant stakeholders, which can contribute to assessing whether states are actually putting in place what the convention is requiring them to do in the areas that I have mentioned. And in this respect, it must be underlined really that civil society representatives play a very important role as well. And these are organizations at the global or European level, not national organizations, but the national organizations can be involved as well through the more pan-European ones. The committee works through the themes. It assesses how parties have implemented the provisions of the convention with respect to a specific theme. And so far, what has been looked into and is very relevant for today's meeting is the theme of protecting children against sexual abuse in the circle of trust. Here, for sure, the issue of reporting is crucial, but also it looked into very recently protecting children which self-generate sexual images of themselves for private reasons, but then might end up finding these images on the internet and be sexually extorted. And therefore, here again, it is really important for them and the professionals in contact with them to know how to report and what to do, etc. So I will be using the findings of the committee in these two main monitoring rounds carried out so far. But there was also an urgent monitoring round, which was focusing on children affected by the refugee crisis. And there too, there was a special focus on reporting, and therefore the outcome that I'm presenting to you also concerns, for example, this specific category of vulnerable children. We can move to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, I am going to present the relevant provisions, therefore the legal framework. And as said at the outset, the convention contains benchmarks. The benchmarks are an indication of the common minimum denominator which has brought together the parties, the states which drafted the convention, and to which all of the current 48 parties have agreed to respect. This means that this is like a baseline, a benchmark, and anything more is obviously encouraged. So the role of the Lanzarote Committee is also that of when it sees that the situation could go even further, to flag how things could be done even better. But the benchmark that we have in the convention as regards reporting suspicion of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse in general is that first and foremost, you can see that this article is composed of two parts. There is one part which concerns professionals in contact with children, and then there is another paragraph which concerns any person. So I will be first looking at what is the situation with respect to reporting by professionals. And in this respect, so the general obligation of parties to this convention is that wherever there are confidentiality rules imposed in internal law on certain professionals working in contact with children, these professionals should be made aware of the fact that such confidentiality rules should not constitute an obstacle for the possibility for them to report to the competent services in the country concerned for child protection any situation where they have reasonable grounds for believing that a child is or might be a victim of sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. So this is the general rule, and we can move to the next slide. And we can therefore extrapolate from this general rule that the minimum common denominator is not an obligation to report, but everything has to be made possible for the professionals to report. So this was the political compromise when the text of the convention was drafted. But this really means that everything needs to be put in place by the parties to the convention in order to ensure that professionals are aware of the fact that these confidentiality rules are not an obstacle to reporting, so they can circumvent that obstacle. And if that is not possible, then the parties are not complying with their international obligations, and they should smooth out the obstacles, because all professionals need to be in a position to report if they so wish. So this is extremely important to underline. What we have observed in the parties that were examined when to see what was in place is that in general, well, most parties have confidentiality rules. Some parties have exceptions to these confidentiality rules. For example, this is an obvious example that you should break the confidentiality if you have to respond to a court order, and this is possible in various countries. But also we have seen, for example, in Austria, there is a specific situation where you have to report if that is in the best interest of the child. So this is maybe something interesting to consider as well. And there is an obligation or a duty to report in a certain number of parties. Actually, there are quite a lot of parties that, even though there is no obligation, they have decided so to build on the minimum standard and go further. And I can say that this is the situation we found in Albania, Austria, Croatia, Denmark, Finland, France, Greece, Iceland, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, the Republic of Moldova, the Netherlands, North Macedonia, Portugal, Spain, and Turkey. And we have also found that in certain cases, this duty to report may entail criminal liability of those professionals who are not reporting. And this is the case, for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Croatia, in Iceland, in Italy, in Luxembourg, in Malta, and in Turkey. So we can move on to the next slide, please. We have in our monitoring procedure the aim is that of learning from each other. The parties want to learn what works well, and in the context of the evaluation of the situation with respect to the circle of trust and the online world, various promising practices were flagged and were picked up as relevant, and you can find them in the monitoring reports of the committee, which are available online. And here I have singled out a few. Well, for the host country of this meeting, I have picked Italy, where already since a certain number of years. So there is a network of 15,000 pediatricians which have been trained to act as sentinel doctors in order to know how to see the signs and recognize the signs of child sexual abuse, and therefore act as a reference point in case of doubt of other professionals who might want to know whether that is something that they should be concerned of. Then we have also flagged the good practice, but it's not only in the Netherlands, but there is a practice in the Netherlands, for example, of a child abuse protocol, where by it is really set out clearly how to respond in a step-by-step procedure, how professionals who are in regular contact with children should respond to signals of child abuse. And in assessing the working of this protocol, the Netherlands communicated that this has shown how there is 3 times more reporting because of the use of the protocol compared to when they didn't have a protocol. Similarly, in Serbia also there is a protocol, but not only there is a protocol, they also prepared a manual to explain in detail how to implement the protocol. So this comes back to what you said at the beginning in terms of outcomes also of the groups. There is a need to understand how to implement guidelines which exist, and these kind of tools work well, at least in the countries which have been assessed by the Lanzarote Committee, have informed us that this has increased reporting. There is also training, which also is linking in well to some of the findings of the working groups that have been communicated at the beginning of this session, where, for example, in Monaco, professionals working in the fields of education, sports, culture, and leisure receive specific training on detecting and identifying child sexual exploitation and abuse, and also are informed of the various possibilities to report. And this is done also on a regular basis, for example, in schools. And this specific practice was communicated to us in the context of the protection of children in the online environment. And in this specific case, really the attention is also focused on how to do that to help identifying signs of potential victims of cyber sexual abuse or exploitation, grooming, or sexual extortion, possibly also live streaming of sexual abuse, etc. So this is really important also with respect to the increasing trends, which will be also pointed out by the discussant to this presentation. We can move to the next slide, please. So to look at how the Lanzarote Committee used these findings, what it has examined, obviously there are many parties which were examined where there were difficulties, and also it was not clear whether what exists is actually implemented in practice, and therefore the committee recommended to the parties to ensure that the confidentiality rules are really not an obstacle for the professionals to report when there is a reasonable ground to believe that a child is a victim. And this is really something that needs to be looked into, and the committee will be assessing how parties have put into effect this recommendation in the next year or so, and therefore we will then be in a position to further recommend how, for example, this specific difficulty can be acted upon with the information that the states will be providing us, and also, of course, with the insights of the representatives of the civil society, which will counterbalance maybe what the states will be telling us from their field experience. We can move on to the next slide, please. And moving on to the next slide, I would like to look into the second part of the Article 12, which we had on the slide previously, which concerns the fact that the Convention requires, highlights the importance for any person to also report suspicion of sexual exploitation or abuse of children. So anyone who might be aware of this should report to the competent services. So the Lanzarote Convention does not indicate which should be the right service to report to. This is left to the discretion of the states, depending on their domestic legal setup. But the crucial thing is that any person who knows about facts of sexual exploitation or abuse of children, or who in good faith suspects that this might have happened, should report. It is very important what we have observed by examining the situation in the countries is that most parties have a general obligation in their criminal code or in their criminal code proceedings, and some do have also specific provisions to encourage the reporting. And we have also found that certain countries have put in place awareness raising campaigns, but really more needs to be done. We can move to the next slide so that I can flag some of the promising practices. These concern in particular awareness raising, because similarly to the professionals in contact with children, the public at large also doesn't necessarily know that one should report, but also how and who to report to. And therefore, any initiative or tool that raises awareness in this respect is to be welcomed and is to be promoted and duplicated and built upon. And Austria is mentioned here because in Austria, there is this brochure that is called No Safe Place brochure, which really has a specific focus on helping how to proceed in the case of sexual abuse of children in the circle of trust. Because this specific, the specificity of the circle of trust is not always singled out in awareness raising campaigns nor in the legislation or codes. And therefore, this is really something that is important, in particular because there are tips and things that one should avoid. One should know, for example, that if the abuse has taken place in the family, there need to be child-friendly, even more so child-friendly reporting mechanisms and awareness of the children themselves, that they can look for help outside of the family context, so as not to make the situation even more difficult by putting one parent against the other, etc. So this is very important, and in the Austrian brochure, this is really something which can be looked at for inspiration by others. Then there are quite a number of countries, I've just listed some: Denmark, Malta, and the Netherlands, which have specific awareness raising campaigns, but there are many more. So I'm sure that in the public you will know about many others in the audience in the room. We can move to the next slide, please. I wanted to highlight one of the gaps which the committee has identified, which was that in certain legislations, in certain parties, there are exceptions for any person to be in a position to report. And these exceptions, for example, concern close relatives, spouses, or first-line blood relatives, certain personalities in the circle of trust, like parents, like priests, like adoptive parents, etc., brother or sister. And in this respect, I must say that the Lanzarote Committee has really underlined the importance that the Article 12, paragraph 2, does not refer to any exception. So any person should be it should be possible for any person to report sexual exploitation or sexual abuse of children. And this reporting shouldn't concern only the children who are below the legal age for sexual activities, because it is important also to make sure that persons and professionals who know that children who have already the legal age for sexual activities might anyhow be victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. And so if we can move on to the next slide, the Lanzarote Committee has really encouraged to make sure that measures are put in place, be they legislative or other, awareness raising tools or campaigns are set up to make sure that anyone is encouraged to report if they are aware of or suspect that somebody is a victim of sexual exploitation and abuse. And this is to the competent services. And if we can move on to the next slide, we will see that the competent services that we have identified in the countries examined can be in general the police or the public prosecutor, but more specifically in many parties, these are child protection units, children and youth services, social authorities, municipalities, etc. So any structure, obviously, that the state has identified is considered to be relevant from the point of view of the Lanzarote Convention. We can move on to the next slide to see what has been flagged as a promising practice. In the Netherlands, there is a Safe at Home organization which was set up specifically for this purpose. And this is a regional body accessible 24 hours every day of the week. And it doesn't only have the task of advising on possible action anyone who is reporting suspicion of sexual abuse against children, but also that of taking urgent measures if need be. So maybe this is one of the examples that can be looked into in terms of something that works and could be replicated elsewhere. And before closing, because I see that I still have just 5 minutes, I would like to move on to the next slide and highlight that the mandatory reporting has obviously proven to be an excellent, promising practice, in the sense that where mandatory reporting is there is more reporting, but not only there is more reporting, there is also more data which is collected, and this can therefore help then to devise prevention policies and for a holistic approach to protecting children against sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. This is really more effective. And just to finish, in the Lanzarote Convention, there is also provision concerning helplines, which is on the next slide, if I'm not wrong. So the convention requires the states to have in place information services, such as telephone or internet helplines, to provide advice to callers. And this should be done also by guaranteeing the confidentiality. And in the context of the assessment of how this provision is implemented in parties, in particular, for example, in the context of the refugee crisis, the committee has, if we can go on to the next slide, pointed out that these helplines should make sure that there is child-friendly language as well, if it is the children themselves who are calling and asking for advice, that there should be somebody who can speak the language of whoever wants to report, in order to for the reporting to be effective, and also not to discourage reporting. One should know that it is possible to report in a language that is known to the person who wants to call. And I think there is still another slide. And yes, most parties have said that they have helplines, but when we have looked at how these are used in practice, there is still much that can be done in order to make it known that this is something that can be used, and also that training has to be delivered to those working on the helplines and hotlines, in order for them to be able to more to gain the trust of those who are calling them. And if I have also just a couple of more minutes, and then I can go into any other question you might have in the question and answer time. The Lanzarote Convention also has another provision, which I have not mentioned on my slides, concerning assistance to child victims. So it is very important to build into this system of reporting also measures that can cater for helping the child victim and his family where need be, and the surrounding of the child in the short term and also the long term, and also in adulthood. So it's very important to also build in the system all of the measures that can support the child, not only from a physical point of view, but also from a psychological point of view. And in this respect, parties should, the convention requires that parties are working together with representatives of the civil society, because in many cases, in many countries, for cultural reasons, the children and their families would trust more the civil society organization than the state authority, and therefore partnerships need to be made between all the sectors concerned. And one of the most promising practices that the Lanzarote Committee brings forward as a model where the child is really at the center is the Children's House model, where re-victimization is avoided and where everything is built really around the child, from when he or she speaks out to everything else, including the assistance provided to him or her. So I think that my time is out in 1 minute, so I will stop here. And thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to hearing the presentation from my discussant, Lisa, and to answer to your questions afterwards, as need be. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.